It's good to be back preaching here at All Saints. I certainly missed it over the season of Lent. So it's good, for me at least, to be here. When I was thinking about what I would preach on this morning, I was reminded of something I've probably shared before. But a few years ago in Chiang, I was going to a particular church. And in the Presbyterian tradition, they only had communion once a month. And on this particular occasion, the pastor celebrated the communion. He had the elements, he said the consecration, and then he added the words, "There is nothing magic happening here." Well, I was a little bit offended by what he was saying, for it was clearly aimed at a certain denomination of people who believed in transubstantiation. And that seemed a little bit of a negative thing to state just before the institution or just after the institution and just before the distribution of the elements. There is nothing magic happening here. And so I did complain, and that complaint was obviously passed on, for in the next month he didn't say that. Just before he gave out the communion, he said, "There is nothing special happening here," which I thought was almost even worse. I actually joked with some friends a little bit later when I found out that although he was the pastor of this church, he wasn't actually ordained. And so after all, he'd been correct all the time. Nothing was happening as he said the words of institution. Well, maybe. But that just made me think about people's attitudes to different things. I've preached many times on Palm Sunday. Obviously this is now, I think, the 6th or possibly the 7th, I think the 6th Sunday that we've had a service on Palm Sunday at All Saints. And each time I've preached on the Jesus triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The meaning of that entry, the meaning of Jesus coming and the people shouting and waving their palms and welcoming him as the King of the Jews. But what I haven't done is preach on the passion of Jesus. For Palm Sunday is also Passion Sunday, when we remember Jesus' death and the events of Holy Week. Palm Sunday begins that week. And there are many, many different services which traditionally are celebrated during Holy Week. Those of you who've read this week's email will have seen all the different days. Holy Monday, Holy Tuesday, Spy Wednesday. What a strange name, Spy Wednesday. That's because it commemorates when Judas went to betray Jesus as a spy in the camp. And then Maundy Thursday, when we remember Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And then of course Good Friday, when we think and meditate on the crucifixion, as we will do this week at All Saints. And then Holy Saturday, when people meditate and remember that Jesus is being in the tomb and dying for us, and then of course the joy of Easter Sunday and the resurrection. But many people can't come on Good Friday or don't come on Good Friday, so we jump from Palm Sunday all the way to Easter Sunday. From Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem to the resurrection on that first Resurrection Sunday. And we miss out all the bit in between. So I was thinking, no, this year I need to preach on the passion of Jesus. For that is one of the things at the center of our faith. In fact, it's so important that the Gospels devote almost half of the chapters in each of the Gospel is devoted to Holy Week and to those events. So I want to ask us, what is the meaning of the cross? Now, those of you who were raised in the evangelical church will have been given a very clear answer. The cross is all about Jesus paying the price for our sins. A price needed to be paid. It's a legal transaction. God is the judge and God is holy, so he had to have payment for sin. And that had to be paid, for somebody had to be punished. That was a very legalistic, and is a very legalistic way of looking at it. Now, of course, this is a metaphor. But it's a very strong metaphor, and it's a very strong idea in many people's minds, that they don't take it as a metaphor at all, but take it as the legal, honest, gospel truth. In fact, some people will say that is the gospel, that Jesus died on the cross to pay the price for our sins because it had to be paid. But I don't think really that is the gospel at all. Of course, the gospel is of God's love and Jesus dying for us, but I don't think that is a really clear way of explaining it. So why do they have such a legalistic view? Well, when I'm teaching physics, which I still do from time to time, I like to challenge my students and ask them the question, why did Newton have laws, but Einstein have theories? Why do we talk about Newton's laws of gravity, but Einstein's theory of relativity? Why is one a law and the other's a theory? Well, actually, it's all to do with history. It's all to do with understanding of the nature of the universe, the nature of the world. Well, back in the 18th, 17th and 18th century, law was seen as supreme. All the scientists, the natural scientists as they were called, sought to determine the laws of nature that God had laid down. The courts were just trying to be fair with laws and work legally. So it wasn't just the decisions of some arbitrary king. It had to be done according to the law, and even the king was seen as being accountable to the law. Government was just starting its parliamentary processes, where laws would be passed, which would be enforced by judges. The early friendly societies and trade unions, the non-conformist churches, all wrote their bylaws, so it was very important that everything was done according to the correct way. And of course, in the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas developed the idea of natural law, for that was at the centre of what God was doing. In England, in the 18th century, there were 220 offences which led to the death penalty. 220 things you could be put to death for doing. Of course, they included things like murder, but they even included malice or appearance of malice from a child aged 17 to 14. That was a death penalty offence. I don't know if any of your children aged 7 to 14 have ever seemed a little bit rebellious, but that could have been subject to the death penalty. Being seen in the company of gypsies for more than 1 month. That was also a capital offence for which you could be executed. Shoplifting, sheep stealing, stealing anything that was more than 12 pence, which is around about maybe 20 cents. Steal anything more than that, you can be put to death. Everything was about law and punishment, and they saw that as the way that society was held together. The only way that people could become safe and that things would remain stable. Little wonder that when they came to the theory of how God operated, this idea of punishment and judgment and paying for the sins, paying for the crime, was so much at the front of their thinking. Jesus' death then was seen as a legal transaction where God had to be propitiated, where God had to be paid, and someone had to pay the price, and someone had to be punished. Now there's all sorts of problems in that because God is somehow punishing God's self, and all sorts of problems come into it. But there is some logic there because it fitted so much with their worldview. And so when the big revivals came of John Wesley and Whitefield and so on, that was the big teaching that they put forward, and it's so much continued in the church until this day. But of course, when the 20th century came, the general view of the world had changed. Instead of having laws of nature, we had theories, the theories of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity. And of course, in the church, they started talking about theories of the atonement. But right back in the pew for the everyday, ordinary person, the same idea stayed. God had to have someone punished, and somebody had to pay the price. Even where people didn't believe it, and I think many people didn't, they still thought that was what they were supposed to believe, even though they couldn't quite accept it or quite understand it. So back to where I started this morning. In the communion service, saying there's nothing magic happening. Well, of course, that was a dig against transubstantiation, a very negative comment. But I was thinking, actually, I want to reclaim that. I want to and pull that statement upside down and talk about the magic of the cross. Not in the sense that the cross was any sort of trick or conjuring sleight of hand, but that it's something mysterious, something magical, something otherworldly, something that we really cannot comprehend. It's certainly nothing we can reduce just to some sort of courtroom drama that might occupy 1 hour of prime-time television. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, very well summed this up quite a number of years ago. I'll just read the section from there. In chapter 14, things have come to the most important point. Aslan, the lion, who represents Jesus, is being captured, and he is to be sacrificed. Chapter 14 says, when once Aslan had been tied so that it was really with a mass of cords, on the flat stone, a hush fell on the crowd. 4 hags, holding 4 torches, stood at the corners of the table. The witch bared her arms, as she bared them the previous night when it had been Edmund instead of Aslan. You see, Aslan the lion is dying in Edmund's place. Then she began to whet her knife. It looked to the children, when the gleam of the torchlight fell on it, as if the knife were made of stone, not of steel, and it was a strange and evil shape. At last she drew near. She stood by Aslan's head. Her face was working and twitching with passion. But he looked up to the sky, still quiet, neither angry nor afraid, but a little sad. Then just before she gave the blow, she stooped down and said in a quivering voice, "And now who has won? Fool, did you think that by all this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you are dead, what will prevent me from killing him as well? And who will then take him out of my hand? Understand that you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. In that knowledge, despair and die." The children did not see the actual moment of the killing. They couldn't bear to look and had covered their eyes. But then a little later from chapter 15. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colours and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into 2 pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end. And there was no Aslan. "Oh, oh, oh," cried the 2 girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Suzanne. "What does it mean? Is it magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. Oh, you're real, oh, Aslan," cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back, into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, she would have read a different incarnation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack, and death itself would start working backwards. Of course, that's only a story, only another metaphor. But everything which we do and say and think to deal with the eternal is metaphor and story. But the central part of the story is never changing. For that is that God loves us, that God went across the threshold of death for us. It's all about the magic of the cross. Not that we can understand it, not that we can comprehend it, not that we can define it, not that we can put it into a small box and write it all down and then it's dealt with, but that we can give thanks. There's no theory which can explain the inexplicable. But salvation is relational. It's all about having a relationship with God and with one another. It's not about escaping from hell, but rather it's coming into the heaven of God's presence. And even God, in some ways, is a metaphor, for God is so much beyond what we can ever understand or explain. So as we approach the joy of Easter, as we celebrate Easter Sunday next week, we can remember the mystery, the mysteriousness, the magic of the cross. It's not about law and logic, it's about God. And as we say, He is risen, and as we wish each other a happy Easter, we can know the peace and the joy of God's love, which is the truth which never ends. Amen.